Friends, we are excited to welcome you to our channel and are pleased to present an in-depth interview with Javier Milei, the President of Argentina.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the authorities of the IDEA Colloquium for this mistake of having invited me. First of all, I also want to congratulate you on the choice of the name of this colloquium, the motivation of it, where the reference of if not is now when it is taken. I do not know if you know it or not, but the book of Perk 14, that refers to it used to say if I am not for me, who is for me?
Del libro de Pirkei Avot 1:14, que hace referencia a Hillel y dice, él solía decir, si yo no estoy para mí, ¿quién está para mí?
And even if I'm all to myself, what am I? But now when? Now let's say basically what I'm going to do is tell Argentina, as a business case, why it is now, and basically I'm going to do a first part, where I'm going to explain why this time it's different, and then I'm going to present Argentina directly as an investment case. Basically, one should ask oneself, well, why will it be different this time? In fact, Reinhardt and Rogoff's book is precisely a narration of how many times it was said that this time is going to be different. And it always ended the same way. In the Argentine case, it always ended badly. So it's a little more challenging to explain why this time will be different. But it is also true that at some point, there may be a change of trend, a structural change, and a change that starts a new era. In fact, the generation of the 37th were just working to make this time different. And boy did they succeed, because when the Alberti Constitution was launched in 1860, from being a country of barbarians in 35 years, we became the first world power. So the main idea of this presentation is to show you why that is feasible, and why this time it can be different. Naturally, to explain why this time is different is, we cannot leave aside the initial conditions that we have faced, because also the way in which we have solved this makes the argument that this time will be different. Basically, we at the time of assuming we were faced with what was potentially the worst crisis in Argentine history, combined the worst elements of the three largest crises in Argentine history. We had a monetary imbalance or monetary surplus, the Manny Oberham, which was twice the one we had in the Rodrigazo.
Los peores elementos de las tres crisis más grandes de la historia argentina. Teníamos un desequilibrio monetario o sobrante monetario, el money overhang, que era el doble del que teníamos en el Rodrigazo.
Consider that at that time when the central bank ran out of dollars and had no choice but to open and devalue, the inflation rate multiplied 6 times if it was double. Imagine that we were traveling at 200%. We were going to 1,200 base, and if it was double, 2,400. On the other hand, when one takes the situation of the central bank in terms of remunerated liabilities, with respect to the monetary base, the situation was quite worse than that of the central bank at the beginning of the 80s, prior to the Alphonse N hyperinflation, which ended at 5,000%. And at the same time, the social indicators were worse than what we had in the previous one of the outbreak of convertibility.
peores de los que teníamos en la previa del estallido de la convertibilidad.
Therefore, it is clear that the situation was extremely complex, and that any mistake would have triggered a crisis of very difficult proportions to imagine, but that in light of what each of these crises were, it is not difficult to imagine that at least poverty would have doubled.
Cada una de estas crisis no resulta complicado imaginarse que por lo menos la pobreza se hubiera duplicado.
Therefore, we would have been at levels of at least 90% or a little more, and probably with half of the population destitute. The basic symptom of all this was reflected in what the inflation rate was. There is always a discussion here, let's say, whether it is valid or not to be doing the annualizations. From my point of view, it is valid because it is at the rate that prices have been moving. And there were elements that allowed a monetary validation that effectively validated them, in fact. Moreover, the day we took over the administration, in that opening speech, I explained how the account was made.
En ese discurso de apertura justamente expliqué cómo se hacía la cuenta.
And I actually did that from the monetary side, because in fact I didn't have the data yet, for example, of what the wholesale price index for December was, for example. In that sense, in the first week of December, prices were traveling at 1% per day, which is 3,700% per year. When you looked at the second week, there had been an acceleration, and prices began to travel at the rate of 7,500. And when you take the wholesale inflation, that is, I usually always work with wholesale inflation because it is usually a leading indicator. That is, it is usually ahead of what happens with retail inflation. And that month, he gave 54%, that in annualized terms is 17,000%. Therefore, there is no doubt that if this had exploded, we would be talking about an absolutely different situation. So, the first thing we clearly had to end was with inflation. Here, without a doubt, it is always key to have a good diagnosis, and fortunately, thanks to that huge team that I have, that Toto Caputo leads. Let's say we were able to give it a certain blow from the first moment, and we started on the hypothesis that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of money supply, either because demand falls, because supply rises, or because both things happen that result in a loss of the purchasing power of money. And consequently, all prices expressed in monetary units rise. Notice that in the very definition I use about the origin of inflation, and about how I look at inflation, I define it not as the generalized rise in prices, but as the loss of the purchasing power of money. I mean, I don't have that bad habit of many politicians who think it's the fault of businessmen who set high prices. I still remember my predecessor in office who said that inflation is produced in the devils. I, the force of heaven, killed them all. And why that very definition of generalized price increase is what allows some old-timers to believe that this is fixed with price controls, when that has never worked in the history of mankind, and if there is a place where it never worked, it was in Argentina too. So, the point was good, to trace the origins of the monetary issue. And also here it was interesting because another thing that exploded in the eyes of anyone who looked at the Argentine case was the twin deficits.
A los ojos de cualquiera que miraba el caso argentino era los déficits gemelos.
Think that when a country has 4% of the GDP of twin deficits is a yellow alert, 8 is a red alert. Because it is on its way to stick a pineapple, we had 17 more or less to have an order of magnitude since the challenge.
Más o menos para tener un orden de magnitud desde el desafío.
Now of those 17, 15 were in the public sector, 5 in the treasury, and 10 in the central bank. So, basically the idea was, well, to attack the problem of the public sector and attack the problem of the central bank. And that is that in that context, we developed the zero deficit program. I remember that when we campaigned with a chainsaw, many people laughed at it and said that it was impossible, and besides, if you looked at Argentine history, it seemed quite complicated because of the last 123 years. Argentina had a deficit of 113. The 10 that it did not have is because it was in default. And also when one took the amount of crisis using the methodology of Ana Mara Serro and Osvaldo Maloney. Argentina since 1901 until today had 23 crises where 21 have fiscal origin, and where they are separated between high fiscal deficit and fiscal excess directly.
La cantidad de crisis utilizando la metodología de Ana María Serro y Osvaldo Meloni, Argentina desde 1901 hasta hoy tuvo 23 crisis, donde 21 tienen origen fiscal y donde se separan entre alto déficit fiscal y desmadre fiscal directamente.
There are a lot of other things more that due to the inheritance, and this I say. I do not want to overload much because I have said it in other places, and I want to leave me more time to discuss the Argentine case. But that seemed virtually impossible, that it could not be adjusted more than 1 point per year, that we were never going to achieve it.
Que no se podía ajustar más que un punto por año, que no lo íbamos a lograr nunca.
Well, we achieved it in the first month of management. That is to say, in the first month of management, we achieved what the Argentine economy had never achieved in 123 years. Naturally, faced with this achievement, obviously, when it was achieved in the first month, by the way, we were also surprised, I don't know. I mean, I believe in the chainsaw, but Toto did it better. There they began to question about the quality of the place, to recognize that the Echinochantis baboons were wrong. They started with that it does not have much of a blender and scissors. And all those little things about these guys who are not heirs of Adam Smith for sure. I do, they don't. But having said that, beyond the parish jokes, basically the first thing we did was to reduce the number of ministries from 18 to 9. Today we already have 8 ministries in addition. The public work was completely eliminated. They said that it was impossible to touch the public work. Of course, because politicians steal from there and we, as we are willing to make a government of honest people. The first thing we cut was the public work. Another thing that they said it was impossible to touch because it was a big job among politicians were discretionary transfers to the provinces. In general, what they were trying to do was to make these transfers to those provinces with the most opaque accounts possible, precisely so that they could steal in that way. Of course, discretionary transfers to the provinces outside. Another thing they said you couldn't do was touch public employees. Not only that we arrived with almost 50,000 public employees thrown out, but also that every time a contract falls out, in most cases it is not renewed. Therefore, we also reduced the number of public employees. Then there is a very interesting part. It happened at a cabinet meeting. We were meeting, and in the middle of the meeting, Toto had to go to a meeting outside Casa Rosada, and then he got up. And I stayed with the rest of the ministers. Then once he finished leaving, I asked each of the ministers explicitly, I told them, that I wanted them to also cut 10% more from each of the expenses of each of the ministries. The most surprising thing is that the following week, each of the ministers brought me a program of reduction and deficit reduction of spending by lowering public spending by 10%. Wow, that is indeed having a commitment to management. In addition, another thing that we did, and that also seemed impossible, was the elimination of intermediaries, that is, to get managers out of the way of poverty. This was probably one of the toughest battles we had to give. This was a battle that was designed with the Minister of Human Capital, Sandra Tovello, the Minister of Security, Dr. Ulrich, and Dr. Ferraro, Guillermo Ferraro, who was in infrastructure, where basically what was raised, because it was what appeared in the headline, and the reason why they criticized Minister Pito so much, was that the compensation of the plan was eliminated. Then they came out to criticize us, saying that now we wanted to give plans without compensation, and that what we were doing was encouraging laziness. That is, as we were even worse than the populace who had left, and that's not understanding what was wrong with that.
Entonces salieron a criticarnos diciendo que ahora nosotros queríamos dar planes sin contraprestación y que nosotros lo que estábamos haciendo era fomentar la vagancia. Es decir, como que éramos aún peores que los populistas que se habían ido. Y eso es no entender qué era lo que pasaba con eso.
We, first of all, were clear that due to the type of adjustment we were making, it was very likely that the strongest impact would be felt during the first trimester. Therefore, it was also important to do it during holidays so that people would not find out so much, so to speak, about what was happening.
Para que la gente no se enterara tanto, por decirlo de alguna manera, de lo que estaba ocurriendo.
On the other hand, we had to ensure that the most vulnerable sectors did not feel the force of the adjustment. So it was very important to give them containment, but the problem is that there was no money.
Entonces era muy importante darles contención, pero el problema es que no había plata.
So, where were we going to get the resources from? It is true that we also aimed for an adjustment of 5, and we overreacted and made an adjustment of 7. And then we were able to recompose other items, but here it was key that it was also what stoked and fed the pickets, who also said that it was impossible to finish with them. And that thanks to this measure and the anti-picket protocol of that wonderful minister that I have who is Dr. Bullrich. Today we live in an Argentina that does not have pickets, something that also seemed impossible. And that we achieved it from the first day of management. In that context, something happened that was. Everyone believed that since the beneficiaries of the plans received a card that prevented them from being intermediaries, and actually, that did not prevent them from being intermediaries because basically, although they charged with a card, at the moment they had to leave the proof that they had provided the service, at that moment was when they charged the toll, and that was when they took out half of the plan.
le cobraban el peaje. Y ahí era cuando le sacaban la mitad del plan.
Then, all of a sudden, they had two plans, and one plan had to be left to the picketer hordes, so that they could just keep collecting the plan.
Para que justamente pudieran, digamos, seguir cobrando el plan.
And how was the benefit? Bring the coupons that were given at the marches, that cost that they had been at the marches. So, one of the things that we did is we removed the obligation of that benefit. So, what happened? People were not obliged to go to realize that they had done something, and therefore, without us turning a single peso more, their income doubled in the middle of the adjustment. But at the same time, that took resources away from the picketers, from the poverty managers. That's why it was so important to have the anti-picket protocol quickly. And that's why it was very important what happened in the first battle we were going to have, and in that context, the transportation system, instead of using it to make a negative campaign, as Massa did throughout the campaign, saying all kinds of aberrations that it is to this day that I have to keep explaining that they are lies, such as, for example, that I'm going to tariff the universities, or that I want to close them, or that I want to privatize them.
Son mentiras, como por ejemplo que voy a arancelar las universidades o que las quiero cerrar o que las quiero privatizar.
So they use all that negative campaigning so they don't get audited. So the question I would ask them is, are you in favor of the jets, and that they are not audited, and that they use the universities to work with politics? Because that's the question. Universities are not going to be privatized, they are going to remain public and non-tariff. All we want to do is audit them, and yet I have to keep answering for this. And in that context, a line of denunciations was put so that they would not let themselves be extorted. And obviously we took 18,000 troops to the street, since Bellivoni was threatening a demonstration of 50,000 and internally he said that it was going to be 100,000. Then this was how it was shown, let's say as a mega success, and the demonstration ended up being 3,000 people. And from that day the pickets in Argentina ended.
Digamos, como un mega éxito, y la manifestación terminaron siendo 3.000 personas, y a partir de ese día se terminaron los piquetes en la Argentina.
Wow, that was a good move too. Because you have three types of wars. They have wars of stocks against stocks. The one who is finished first loses. They have wars that are flow against flow, they never end, or they have wars that are flows against stock. The silly thing that the Argentine policy had been in this aspect was that the enemy was being given flow all the time. And this design between Dr. Tobello, Dr. Ulrich, and Dr. Ferraro made it become a war of flows against stock. And we had the flow, and they had the stock. They were going to make a big bet, and then the different marches were going to deflate. And indeed that's what we did, but well, in the middle we had to put up with the criticism that we were encouraging vagrancy. Those, so that when they go through the capital and can travel comfortably, say sorry my law.
Digan, perdón, Milei.
Naturally, there was also a liquefaction of salaries in the public sector, and obviously, let's also say that it impacted retirements that today are above 10% of what they were above inflation, and above what they were in November, and not only that, but also in dollars they tripled.
Y no solo eso, sino que además en dólares se triplicaron.
That God basically was the chainsaw program, something that was never done, and we messed with a lot of sacred cows. Because we messed with public works, with transfers, we messed with everything, we messed with the managers of poverty. Therefore, it's not that it was impossible, it just had to have the courage to do it, and we had it. On the other hand, that only fixed a third of the program. We still had the problem of the central bank. Let's say, what was the quasi-fiscal deficit? And that implied endogenous emission of money, and therefore, let's say, if we wanted to cut with inflation, we had to end with the quasi-fiscal. There was also very important the fact of systematically starting to show the fiscal balance, and that it was something that had come to stay, and that it was not something transitory. Because here there is something very important. If I go to the zero deficit, the increase in debt is null.
Porque acá hay algo muy importante. Si yo voy a déficit cero, el incremento de deuda es nulo.
Therefore, the debt-to-product ratio is not increasing, and if the debt-to-product ratio is not increasing, therefore one is temporarily solvent, and sooner or later, the country risk is going to collapse, and we received it about 3,000. And today it is fighting to break the 1,000. So it seems that we are doing well there too. And it's not that it's going down because of a type 2 error problem. It seems to me that having achieved it based on having its fiscal solvency is an inaldale achievement and very far to regret. I mean, that's why someone's tincture burned his brain. So, in that cleaning of the central bank, we had to face the issue of remunerated liabilities. Moreover, what the LELICs were, let's say that they were instruments for 30, 60, 90, 180, 270 days. The previous government had spent a whole day. In such a way that if the crisis triggered, the amount of January could be multiplied by 5 in one day. Obviously, that would have implied a brutal inflationary explosion, and by the end of the year, we were no longer in power. And they were returning to the government, but with all the dirty work done. Well, we didn't indulge him. They're still eating popcorn, they must be that fat. Moreover, with all the one that was taken from the dust jackets, it will surely be able to stay well-rounded. So, there we also gave a very important battle at the beginning, because that was what a large part of the profession suggested to us. And that was to raise the interest rate, to take it to positive territory, the real interest rate. And the reality is that if we had done that today, we would be discussing a relationship monetary liabilities against the base of more than 10 times, and we would be discussing the carry trade. And we would be discussing when we would be about to blow up. And we would be discussing that inflation does not go down because the expectation of issuance. Since those remunerated liabilities are future issuance, consequently, he never came down. With which it would have been a huge mistake. There is obviously a whole discussion, let's say, about using the interest rate or not. I commented on that at the last meeting of the central bank, but what we decided was to arbitrate the rate in dollars. Given the jump in the exchange rate, which was neither more nor less than a sincerity, because I am amused by the intellectual dishonesty of some saying no. My law arrived and devalued. Let's say, as if the gap did not exist, and as if the central bank was bursting with reserves. I mean, there really are people who... I don't know if you don't listen. Don't read what you write. I mean, you can't be so intellectually dishonest. but by arbitrating the rate in dollars and in a stabilization process and with a sincerity of prices, it will be obvious that the interest rate in pesos, even being negative in real terms, that it could be arbitrated with the dollar rate. And that at the same time allowed us to liquefy the remunerated liabilities, and meanwhile, we continued consolidating the fiscal balance. And when it was already clear the solidity of the fiscal balance, there began a huge task of the Secretary of Finance, Pablo Curno, in conjunction with the central bank, where they began to remove the remunerated liabilities from the balance sheet of the central bank, and began to go where it should have gone whenever it was in the treasury. Because in the fund those remunerated liabilities arose from having generated fiscal deficit, from having financed it with monetary issuance, and that through another window, Carlos becomes paying taxes. So that, let's say, the fiscal problem turned it into a problem of future inflation. And that's also interesting, because no one was saying how to solve it when the answers when I raised this were absolutely ridiculous. And no one knew how to solve it. Well, not only did we solve it in 6 months, and by the 7th month, the quasi-fiscal deficit was over. Something that seemed impossible, we also made it possible. And after we managed to turn off the tap on remunerated liabilities, we switched to the zero money oversupply scheme. I remember that I presented it at the stock exchange and explained that only then were we going to buy dollars, that is, that the only source of emission that was going to remain was the purchase of dollars, and one of the things that we realized is that we were wrong with that scheme. If you take the traditional books of international monetary economics, you are going to find that when someone, let's say, goes and sells the dollars, or put another way, buys pesos from the central bank, that has demand for money and does not generate inflation. Well, that's true in a world where there are no capital controls. When you have capital controls, you go and buy pesos, not because you want to, but because you are obliged, and therefore, it is differential between what you would like to have and what you are actually buying is what generates pressure on the price level. And in the face of a speculative attack where the dollar was quoted 1,500 pesos, and they anticipated that the following week it would go to 2,000 and so on, we decided to change the monetary scheme and go directly to zero emission.
Decidimos cambiar el esquema monetario e ir directamente a emisión cero.
Well, it seems that it also worked, and something happened that never happened in Argentina. And that is that the $1,500 fell to 1,100. So what also seems impossible, we also made it possible. So, the result of all this is that the wholesale inflation that was at 54%, that is, annualized at 17,000. Yesterday, the retail inflation was known the last data, and basically the inflation of September was 2%. That is to say that if we have inflation at 17,000, we take it to 28%, and have no doubt that we are going to continue lowering it.
La inflación de septiembre fue del 2%. Es decir que de tener la inflación en el 17.000 la llevamos al 28% y no tengan duda que la vamos a seguir bajando.
In addition, it is also very interesting how this was achieved, because this also makes it different this time. Because we did not do it having a previous hyperinflation that involved a deep liquefaction of financial assets, in such a way that stabilization was rapid. We also achieved them without an expropriation, that is, we did not resort to the violence of a Bonex plan, or to a compulsive renegotiation, or a default, or any equivalent.
cualquier equivalente.
Let's say that's why when they said, when do they finish cleaning the paid ones? And I don't know, the answer is I'm not a dirigist, I'm a liberal, and this is a market process. And we're going to end up cleaning them up according to the market, let's move them to another instrument. Therefore, this is also a novelty for the Argentine economy, that we did it without expropriation and without default. Another important feature is that we are doing all this without controlling prices, which also makes a big difference. On the other hand, we also did it without fixing the exchange rate, because if you fix the exchange rate, this happens faster. And as if all this were not enough, we did it in a recomposition of relative prices. The previous government had left the prices far behind, and we are recomposing them. And today the prices cover more than 80% of the costs. Therefore, this is really a different way to lower inflation than how the previous programs were done in the Argentine case. And as if all this were not enough, one could say, well, but what happened in terms of activity? Look here. The most similar program in terms of adjustment that was made in Argentina, much smaller than this one, but of an important magnitude, was what happened with Dubaldi in the 2002. That year, the GDP fell 10.9%, and in the second quarter, which is when the adjustment fully entered, the economy fell 16%. Moreover, days ago, Deputy Minister Dasa said that all the experiences of strong adjustments, not like the one we made, but of important adjustments, in each of those cases, the GDP had fallen by at least 10%. I tell you that if we take the latest data of the seasonally adjusted IMEI and compare it with November of December, the drop is just 0.6. Percent. If you want to look at it in industry with the latest data, it is already at the same levels as November. In other words, there was a negative impact in the first quarter, and it has already begun to reverse. Therefore, in addition, the economic program was so well designed that it also meant not having to suffer heavily in terms of activity. And today the utilization of installed capacity is already above what we had last year. But not everything was stabilization. That is, not only a stabilization program was made, but also a set of structural reforms were made, and between the DNU, the 7023rd, and the Basic Law, a reform was made 8 times larger than the one made by Menem, but with the situation that the reform made by Menem was the largest in Argentine history.
Ocho veces más grande que la que hizo Menem. Pero con la situación de que la reforma que hizo Menem fue la más grande de la historia argentina.
Therefore, I want you to be historically aware that we are living through a government that made the largest structural reform in Argentine history. Now that's different too. And what does that imply? It implies that we are going to jump 90 positions in terms of economic freedom, and those countries that are more free are 12 times richer than the repressed ones. They have 25 times less poor in the standard format, and 50 times less in the extreme format, and that we are walking to institutions that today could be compared with those of Germany, France, Italy, any of the countries of Europe. Therefore, also that, in fact, at the conference Juan Pablo Nicolini presented a paper on, for example, maintaining fiscal balance. With that we would have a potential to double GDP in 10 years, that is, a GDP per capita growth rate of 7%, and as if all this were not enough, I have a luxury of a minister who is the Colossus Federico Sturzenegger, who deregulates something every
Como
day.
si todo esto fuera poco, tengo un lujo de ministro, que es el coloso Federico Sturzenegger, que todos los días desregula algo.
That is to say, there is not a day that Federico does not make my day when I read his Twitter account. Thanks, Federico. And now is when I'm going to start selling you the Argentine case. Because once I talk about the RIGI there, I'm going to start watching. I'm going to put Argentina as if it were a business and the RIGI there. I took active participation in the R format, and so if not later, they don't like the river, and I can fuck myself with all the desire. Because I was deeply involved, and I put my little hands in there so all the fingers are marked, they are going to see all the dirty fingers.
Participación activa en el formato del RIGI. Y así que si no, después no les gusta el RIGI, me pueden putear con toda la gana porque estuve involucrado profundamente y metí las manitas ahí adentro. Así que están todos los dedos marcados, van a ver todos los dedos sucios.
I have everything. So now I'm going to tell you what things I got into. If that's against those he's ranting at, know that it's my fault. One of the things we explicitly put into the RIGI was respect. Of the financial economic equation of the business. That is, the financial economic equation of the business is the account that you use for when calculating the value of a company. That is, if you had a regulated company, for example, and that basically what is done to a regulated company is that the quasi-income is made null, implies that it will have a return similar to the opportunity cost. That in a regulated company, the GUAC is also regulated, so to speak in some way, and in that sense. For example, in the case of a regulated company, you look for a price path such that the balance to zero, that is, the IR is equal to the WACC. So you can rewrite it in terms of the revenue needed to cover the cost of operation and maintenance, the tax cost, and the return on capital.
El costo fiscal y la retribución del capital.
That is, they are different ways of describing the same equation. But the most interesting thing about that equation is that you have an element that allows you to quantify the effects of the atrocities that the state can cause, whether it raises taxes, whether it modifies or creates new taxes or modifies the playing field. In the case of a regulatory company, it is easier, I say, because it would be a modification in regulation. But I suppose you are a company that is dedicated to renting offices, and a government appears and puts rent law. That was impossible to touch. We did it the first day, and boy, is it working.
Pero supongan que ustedes son una empresa que se dedican al alquiler de oficinas. Y aparece un gobierno y le pone ley de alquileres, que era imposible tocar. Nosotros lo hicimos el primer día y vaya que está funcionando.
So, the fact of incorporating the financial economic equation of a business means that every time the state or a government wants to make fiscal policy hurting the private sector, the cost of the account will be much greater than the positive that it can generate.
Haciéndole daño al sector privado, el costo de la cuenta va a ser mucho más grande de lo positivo que puede generar.
Therefore, let's say we are tying them hand and foot to future politicians. So do we, but like us, we don't want to do that kind of thing. Look at this. We are going to a zero deficit and zero emission scheme in an election year. Can you tell me which politician in the world has done that in the history of mankind? Because from my point of view, it never happened. At the same time, another thing that we put in the RIGI in the original version was the choice of 3 courts. So you could choose one of those 3 courts. In these 3 courts, the modification that I came up with for me is that one chooses a court, but if over time you are not happy with that court, you can change it. That is, to have flexibility that if a court does not give an answer, to change the court. In other words, the politicians expropriating wealth creators are going to end the fuck. It's going to end with that because if one court doesn't respond, they're going to go to another. But besides, that wasn't enough for me. I wanted a little more. I was pretty insatiable that day, it seems. Maybe because I come from the private sector. And another thing that occurred to me was to add a local court, because when one looks at the experience of other cases, international courts always demanded a lot of time, and on the other hand with local courts, that flows much faster. Now, that local court is obliged to take the results generated by antitrust. And competition defense is going to have a special unit for Riga and those who are the ones who follow the Riga contracts. And the Riga situations are going to have to know about micro, they are going to have to know about macro. They are going to have to know about loan economics, they are going to have to know about law. They are going to have to also know about finance and very especially about company evaluation and economic regulation. And they are going to have to now, let's say, there is going to be an income test everywhere. But that exam is going to be designed by some notable, and I am not the notable. The notable ones are Federico Sturzenegger, Toto Caputo, Santiago Van Fusilli, and I will put some additional evil, but with which it will be a unit intended to take care of investors, with which they will always be able to opt for the local court under these characteristics as well. Why am I saying this? Because already entering Argentina proper, if you would like to evaluate a project, you will be looking at the flow of funds. Now, the flow of funds is wonderful, but you can have a phenomenal business. But if later the state or a government comes and expropriates you, the mechanism does not work. That is to say, it is very important, probably one of the most important institutions, next to respect for life and freedom, is the right to property. Not for nothing did we say at this year's sessions that it was life, freedom, and property, and here. Private property is going to be respected, it is going to be strictly respected, because what it is going to allow is that savers can save, and they are going to be defended. In fact, the way in which we disarmed the situation of the central bank was to respect the right of property, and that also implies that we are not going to advance on the results of the investment. For us, the one who earns money is not an evil person. For us, the one who earns money is a social benefactor. That is to say, he is a hero. That is to say, he is someone who is fixing your life. Because you can only be successful by serving others, it is convenient to have better quality at a better price, therefore. Far from chasing him, we are going to celebrate him, we are going to applaud you, and in that situation where we respect savings, respect investment, subtract property rights, that is what will result, is in a process of capital accumulation in per capita terms that will raise the productivity of Argentines and will make us all richer. So, that's clearly non-negotiable, like none of the basic parts of my program, as you may have seen by now. Because when I said that if the fiscal degenerates did things that damaged the fiscal balance, I was telling you it's not going to cheer up. Come on. Tell me if I didn't cheer up. But apart from that, another thing I want to mention is, well, then you are going to choose a sector. You can imagine that being a liberal, I'm not going to be getting involved in promoting something particularly. I don't pick the winners. This is very interesting because on many occasions some old-timers say, but they don't have a program. They don't have a stabilization program, and they miraculously lowered inflation from 54 to 2, which, by the way, is induced inflation too, right? Expect that we will arrive if we achieve it in consumer, and we will see what happens with the stocks later. They already know, of course they know. But having said that, from our perspective, a stabilization program has three legs: a fiscal policy, a monetary policy, and an exchange rate policy. In the fiscal, zero deficit; in the monetary, zero emission and currency competition, which is already happening, so that those who have great fears about exchange rate appreciation do not worry. We are allowing supply and demand of dollars to be mapped voluntarily by individuals. Therefore, they are not going to have an abrupt fall in the exchange rate that is so fast that it does not allow them to adjust in the real sector and end up in bankruptcy. It is contemplated, but do not be afraid. Now you can make transactions in dollars and in any other currency. So cheer up, that's not a problem. Stop being scared by economists who seem to have died with the dinosaurs and resurrected and maintain the same custom as the dinosaurs. Apart from that, it is clear that Argentina has sectors that are very interesting, that I also suggest that they put it when they do the analyses of the real exchange rate. First, I say, the issue of the analysis of the real exchange rate is quite debatable, but it seems to me more questionable of when the series are cut. Why do they cut the series at 2002 or 2003? Why don't they cut it in the 91st? No, because it's going to hit him too low there. Then they can't come with. There is no real exchange rate problem. That is, with which we can already say that the problem involved when choosing the date is not a minor issue. But even so, I warn you, with everything that is happening in energy matters, with everything that has to do with oil and gas, the most likely thing is that Argentina will, without a doubt, go to a much more appreciated currency level. I mean, why? Because there are enormous opportunities in oil and gas issues that clearly respecting property rights investments will appear. And in fact, the rig already has adds for more than 50,000 millions of dollars of investments, and many companies are already investing. Moreover, many of the companies are already placing debt below 8% in dollars, and Pampa himself did it at 5.75. Therefore, get ready, because there is a tremendous surge of dollars coming from that place. Obviously, with the presence of RIGUI, investments in mining, let's say the most emblematic would be copper and lithium, are also going to be making a great contribution. Undoubtedly, our countryside, as long as we can grow and lower taxes, that, let's say, we are going to go against withholdings. And that will also allow the countryside sector to expand more strongly. Therefore, agriculture and livestock have a lot to contribute here, and obviously in an economy that generates all this, let's say, generates a lot of opportunities in terms of services. That is, moreover, in an economy that has been eating capital for so long, the marginal productivity of capital is high. That thing we see in microeconomics, that an abstraction appears, do you know what that means? That the ear of the assets is huge. In other words, the ear of the firm's cash flow is enormous. Therefore, in addition, if we work hard to lower the cost of capital, investments would have to flow very strongly. And then another thing that we are working on intensively, and especially with Dr. Riedel, is on the topic of artificial intelligence.
es en el tema de inteligencia artificial.
From our point of view, artificial intelligence is like a kind of industrial revolution, but reloading. When you look at the statistics of GDP growth per capita over the period from year zero of the Christian era to now, that series is usually described as a hockey stick. It is a series that is practically constant for 1800 years and then hits a strong acceleration as a result of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Well, artificial intelligence is going to make that process look like child's play because it's going to be much deeper. And for artificial intelligence to develop, you need to have cheap energy in cold places and with high expanses of land. Argentina, therefore, too. But I only say this for the purposes of merely enunciating sectors that do have enormous potential. That I am not going to explain it to you because you are in the trench and know it much better than I do. And it would be a fatally arrogant type to believe that I can tell you something about your business to you who are the ones at the foot of the cannon, but only to mention them as cases of things that can happen and that in fact are happening. And then there are the impacts of the macro on the flow of funds, and there we have elements that make the short term and long term. In the short term, it has to do with the cyclical recovery at the beginning of the presentation. I talked about the utilization of installed capacity, as it has been rising, and there basically what is pushing is the recovery of real wages. Let's say 5 months in a row ago that real wages in Argentina have been rising, and that pensions have also been rising in real terms. To that we must also add the reversal of the stock cycle, that is to say, when we were about the end of the previous government. As a way of covering themselves, companies got overloaded, and in that sense, in the first part of the year, they liquidated the stocks, and that deepened the fall of the first quarter, and now there is a recomposition of stocks. And that is what is making the cyclical recovery factors are pushing positively. Obviously, then there is everything that has to do with long-term growth, and there everything that has to do with structural reforms, and with what is being done in terms of regulation, and being that our goal is to become the freest country in the world, that also implies a sharp drop in transaction costs. At the same time, there is a strong increase in savings. The fact of having run to the middle treasury and made a fiscal saving of 15 points of GDP, those resources now, which were taken by the public sector, are now going to be available in the private sector. Not for nothing, let's say, in December we were discussing hyperinflation, and today we are discussing 30-year mortgage loans. Or how a company could place debt on the local market at 575. Not only that, but also the elimination of inflation. What it does is that it lowers the distortion of prices. If inflation has a harmful effect, that is, the price system is a mechanism of information transmission, coordination and adjustment, and if you basically have inflation, what it does is that it flows with noise. So, I can be explaining here. I can be very good at explaining. You can be very intellectually gifted people and understand without any problem what I am saying. But imagine that from now on there starts to be noise and more noise. I keep explaining. Well, you guys are still very smart people, but the noise doesn't allow us to communicate. That's what inflation does to the pricing system, and when it does, that you lose a lot of transactions. And there's a loss of efficiency in resource allocation. Well, our zero-emission program ensures that the central bank won't bother you anymore. And why am I saying this? Because as endogenous dollarization progresses, and they start making transactions in dollars freely, there is going to be a moment when the whole dollar operation is going to be very big, and the peso operation is going to be very small. And when that situation occurs, we will be in a position to close the central bank, and that politicians will never be able to cheat them with the inflationary tax again in life. On the other hand, I'm already close to finishing. Warning. Another thing that is very important in a business is growth, and growth when you take the empirical evidence in economic growth. There is a phenomenon that is called convergence. It is the situation under which a country that is lagging behind catches up to the big countries. Argentina could become a power in 35 or 40 years. But seriously power, not, let's say, midboard. Power. Let's see, I mean, when I speak, for example, my model looks like Ireland. Ireland, from being the most miserable country in Europe in 40 years, today has a fart, and per capita 50% higher than that of the United States. That's the point that I like, that Argentina is the country with the greatest economic freedom in the world. That is going to be prosperous for us. And then there is a situation, let's say it is this convergence thing, and actually, when one looks at the literature of the Austrians, it is very interesting because Hayek spoke of the market as a process of discovery. So, as you are discovering things, then you are growing. Now, what is the interesting thing? Why can those who come from behind grow up faster? Because the rest of the things were already discovered by someone else. All they have to do is copy it. That is to say, many of the businesses are already invented. The wheel does not have to be invented. They just have to be brought in. This facilitates the growth in convergence, and obviously we are generating the conditions from what we propose from artificial intelligence, and from what we propose as a mechanism in what has to do with the institutional thing to promote a free economy, and that people can carry out their projects, and that their P-tur and the creative destruction that is what will make us grow later when we are in the vanguard will take place. But we have 30, 40 years to copy beautifully and move forward strongly. Therefore, it is not so difficult. And finally, the issue of the discount rate, as I told you, fiscal solvency implies a fall in Argentine risk, and that basically allows the interest rate to fall. In fact, one of the things that we were doing with Federico when we were discussing the issue of universities is that apart from the negative signal that implied to be giving in the fiscal numbers, and that at the same time implied to be bent by the corrupt because the problem is that they do not want to be audited. So, we weren't even willing to bow down to the corrupt, and we weren't willing to hand over the fiscal numbers, but we said, well, let's do the math. What if one took this increase, and one of what I saw when I gave that increase? In the background, there is a very interesting book called Histories of the Fifth Floor, and shows how after the original stabilization of the Austral, Sue Ruiz begins, at Alfonsina's indication, to give a quarter point like that to each one. To you I give 0.25. I give you 0.15. He gave everyone everything. It ended up returning the fiscal deficit and ended in hyperinflation. So, what we did is, the exercise is good. Let's see the incremental effect of the money that goes to universities. And we go back to doing the unpresentables from before. That is to say, we are returning to a world of 3,000 country risk that, by the way. The unpresentables who had the country risk between 1,000 and took out a lot of resources to the universities. And then they are the ones who say that they are going to defend it. It's interesting. I mean, there are those hypocrites, and there are the direct jets, the ones who steal directly with the universities. But then we took out the account, and it was in 1 year, we hold on, and we stick to our fiscal policy. And I pay all the political costs then. That makes the GDP 600,000 left. Millions of dollars, and if we give in and go back to the usual ways, it goes to 400,000. Millions of dollars. This is interesting because when you take in terms of resources for universities, in dollars they remain constant. That is, all that increase, but in a dirtier macro, the resources ended up being constant. But what's the problem with the filthiest macro? First, GDP per capita in dollars is lower, but the important thing about the fall in GDP per capita in dollars is that it has two components. There is a component of falling activity that is 1/3, but the remaining 2/3 is due to a jump in the real exchange rate. And that implies that the number of poor and indigent people increases. Therefore, as a business, it was not only terrible because the GDP per capita was smaller, but also involved a multiplication and increase in the number of poor and indigent. So, when you, let's say, the account is so clear, the other thing that should be clear to you is that these people are not defending either the university or the interests of Argentines. That all they want is to defend their bullshit and end up taking a government that forces them to work. That forces them to work decently and stop screwing with politics. The other argument, and it's already the pre-last one, so I'm already finishing, warning. It is the reduction of macro volatility. If that reduction in volatility is an element that adds value, if you want, the Sharpe ratio is going up. Obviously, in the perspective of real options, you could say that I have less volatility, then those adoptions could be worth less. Well, all that macro volatility that we're taking out, put all the volatility of the business into it. Let's say it's for you to create wealth and not because, let's say, there's a bunch of arrogant politicians ruining everyone's life. So I leave that volatility in your hands. Therefore, since the flow of funds goes up either because we respect their property rights, because we are not going to allow them to expropriate them, because basically there are business opportunities, because there is growth, and also because at the same time the discount rate is falling, if I become a portfolio manager, I would say long duration in Argentina. That is, Argentina is an asset to buy, to be bought long, and what can be done to be buying long. It is to make real investments. Therefore, Argentina is an excellent business case. And so, now yes, I want to go back to the original phrase of Percayabat that used to say, if I am not for me, who will be for me? I mean, if I don't take care of myself, who's going to take care of me? That is, more liberal and possible. That is, you are responsible for your own destiny. You are the architects of your own future. In other words, if you don't take care of yourself, who will? The states know. Because the state can only do harm, because the state produces nothing for the state. When the state gives something, it is because someone surrounded it. That's why we have made the most liberal policy in all of Argentine history, because we have reduced the weight of the private sector state by about 13 points of GDP, because we have made the biggest adjustment in history, because we have run the state by more than 6 points of GDP, let's say, if they only take the treasury. Therefore, they were never given back so many freedoms besides in such a short time. Therefore, that is, if you are not there for you, if you are not taking care of you, who is going to take care of you? Moreover, and even if they take care of you, you take care of yourselves. The question is, what am I? What are they? Are you an entrepreneur? You are the ones who create wealth. You are the social benefactors. You are the ones who have the key to make Argentina great again. You are the big ones responsible. You are the ones who can change this reality. We are only giving you a smooth playing field, a playing field on which you can play. We are giving you the rules of the game. We are giving you the framework, but the creation of wealth is going to depend on you. That is, you are the ones who are going to put on Argentine skin. You are the ones who are going to make Argentina great again. And then the final question is, and if not now, when? It's now. It's now because this has never happened in Argentine history, but for this to last, it needs to be successful. And this is going to be successful when there is growth, and growth is going to happen when you decide to shoulder your role as entrepreneurs and go out and win the market, and that is what will bring prosperity to all of us. So God bless the Argentines, may the forces of heaven be with us, and long live freedom, fuck.